Dead America. Boise, Part 1, by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1, Day 0 plus 63. Emmett, Idaho, just to the northeast of downtown Boise. The sun hung low in the morning sky as Private Kowalski ran through the back alley of the mid-sized town. With a deft move, he darted around the outstretched hands of a zombie, which grasped nothing but air. Kowalski glanced back as he rushed past the ghoul, spotting the dozen others he had maneuvered around. Between their deteriorated state and the freezing cold temperatures, the zombies weren't moving all that fast, making it easy for Kowalski to make his way deep into the town. "2 more blocks, you got this, Kowalski," he muttered to himself. The sniper let out a huff as he picked up the pace, continuing to rush down the alleyway toward the outer edge of town. After blowing by a few more zombies, he reached his destination, a 2-story brick building that sat on the corner. As he stopped and looked around for a way up, he could hear moaning coming from around the corner. Even without seeing what was making it, he knew it was a mob larger than he wanted to deal with. "I swear to God, if there's nothing at this place, I'm going to lose my shit," Kowalski grumbled. As Kowalski looked around for a way up, he noticed movement coming from the corner of the building. A large zombie shambled around, drawn to the muttering that the private was doing under his breath. Moving on instinct, Kowalski strolled over to the creature, casually drawing his knife and jamming it into the ghoul's forehead in a seamless motion. The bloody blade was sheathed before the zombie hit the cold pavement. "Are you in position yet, Kowalski?" Sergeant Copeland's voice crackled in his ear. Kowalski reached up to his ear, adjusting the earpiece's volume so that Copeland's voice didn't deafen him. "Almost, Sarge. Just need to get up top." "Copy that," Copeland replied. Kowalski continued to look around the alley for something that would help him get up to the roof. However, nothing stuck out. Outside of the shambling corpses that were coming his way, there wasn't anything in view. "Christ, did none of these businesses take out the trash?" Kowalski muttered under his breath. With no other options, Kowalski turned his gaze skyward, spotting a drainage pipe that stopped 7 feet off the ground. He couldn't tell if it was purposely built that way or if the building was just in a poor state of disrepair. Whatever the reason, he knew that it was his only way up. "I swear, nothing's ever easy," he sighed. Kowalski backed up as far as he could, planting his back against the wall of the other building before pushing off with everything he could muster. With several quick steps, he built up his momentum before leaping up. Kowalski planted his foot on the brick, pushing up as hard as he could, giving him just enough height to grab onto the bottom of the drainage pipe. It took him a moment to steady himself, wrapping both arms around the pipe and planting his feet against the wall. With a subtle grunt, he began pulling himself up, glancing back down to the alleyway to see the zombies he had darted around catching up to him. As they shambled up, they pressed themselves against the wall, reaching up towards their meal. "That is not a crowd I want to surf on," Kowalski remarked, a wry smile forming on his lips. He let out another grunt as he slowly made his way up. As he pulled himself up onto the roof, he stayed low, crawling along it toward the front of the building. The moans below got louder as he got closer to the edge, and while he couldn't see the full street from his vantage point, he could see enough. Dozens of ghouls all milling about in the intersection, just waiting for something to draw their attention. Kowalski stayed low until he was within a few feet of the edge. Once in position, he grabbed the large sniper rifle that was strapped to his back, taking a moment to get it set up. Peering through the scope, he honed in on a large factory a few hundred yards away across a large open field. "Hey Sarge, I'm in position," Kowalski reported. "Good job, Kowalski. Did you have any trouble?" Copeland asked. "A few of the locals seemed eager to introduce themselves to me, but I pushed through them like a pop star through paparazzi," Kowalski quipped. There was a light chuckle coming from the other end of the communicator before Copeland continued. "So talk me through it. What do you see?" Kowalski settled in, looking carefully through the scope toward the factory in the distance. Scanning the outer edges of it, he spotted a few dozen zombies pressed up against the fence and wandering aimlessly, with none of them being interested in anything in particular. "It's just the usual assortment of stragglers, at least along the southeastern fence," Kowalski reported. "What about our militia friends?" Copeland asked. "You mean the militia friends that the scouts swore they saw?" The same militia friends that made me have to run through the zombie gauntlet to get into position? Those militia friends? Kowalski replied with a hint of sarcasm. I'm guessing by your snarkiness that you don't see any of them, Copeland observed. No, Sarge, I don't. I don't even see signs that anybody alive has been here in weeks. None of those things are pooling up near the building. I don't see a string of corpses on the ground. Just nothing. Are you sure the scout wasn't just a moron? Kowalski asked. He has a good reputation, Kowalski. So if he said he saw the militia in the area, then I'm inclined to believe him, Copeland responded. Well, if they were here, then they were surgical as hell and did a great job of cleaning up after themselves. Because I'm not seeing anything, Kowalski concluded. Copy that, Kowalski. We're in position and are about to move up to the target, Copeland informed him. Well, I'll be here freezing my ass off, so don't be too long, Kowalski said, his voice tinged with mock annoyance. We'll be quick. I've seen your ass, Kowalski. There isn't much there to freeze, Copeland teased. Kowalski let out a laugh as he raised his middle finger in the air in the general direction of the sergeant. I saw that, Copeland remarked. There's no way in hell you saw that, Kowalski retorted. You're right. I assumed you were flipping me off. Thank you for confirming it, Copeland responded, a grin evident in his voice. Damn it, Kowalski muttered, shaking his head. Copeland let out a laugh as he clicked off his communicator and turned towards the rest of his team. Private Johnson and Private Baker were busy checking their weapons and getting mentally prepared for the raid, the three of them standing in the kitchen of a small house. Kowalski says there's no sign of the militia, Copeland informed them. So it's a clean run then? Baker asked. Just the usual assortment of shamblers. It should just be another walk in the park, Copeland replied. Yeah, well, hopefully this park has what we're looking for. This is the 7th one of these factories we've hit, and not a single one of them had anything. No payloads, no raw materials, nothing, Johnson complained. $20 says it's empty, Baker offered. $20? Don't go breaking the bank there, big spender. If you're that confident, then why don't you bet something real, like some rations? Instead of offering up something that's completely worthless these days, Johnson shot back. Because truth be told, Johnson, I don't really care. I was just hoping you'd say you're on and drop the whole whining act without overthinking it. But I guess that's on me for assuming you didn't have a brain, Baker replied with a smirk. Johnson shot Baker a glare, prompting some laughter from both men. If you two have wrapped up your little comedy routine there, can we get this show on the road? Or do you have a second act? Copeland interjected, his tone half serious. Both privates looked sheepishly at the ground as they shook their heads. Sorry, Sarge. It's just frustrating out here, Johnson admitted. Yeah, I know, Johnson. But look at the bright side, at least you aren't freezing your ass off on a rooftop like Kowalski, Copeland said, attempting to lighten the mood. Johnson let out a chuckle as he nodded in agreement. Come on, let's get up there and see what we can see, Copeland instructed. Copeland led the trio out of the small house that was to the southwest of the factory, which was a few hundred yards away from their position. As they stepped out into the yard, all three of them got their assault rifles in the ready position. The trio moved swiftly across the open grass, rushing across the field toward the factory. It took a few moments of running through the open area before they got close to the fence and the handful of creatures that were still oblivious to their presence. Copeland made a series of hand motions to the others to cover him as he slung his rifle over his shoulder and yanked out his knife. The sergeant made a beeline toward the closest zombie, jamming the blade deep into the back of its skull and dropping it to the ground. Copeland wasted no time in dispatching the other three nearby ghouls, slipping the knife into their brains with relative ease before tossing them aside. Are we still good? Copeland asked, glancing back to Baker and Johnson, who had their eyes trained on the surrounding area, scanning for any sign of militia movement. The only things they saw, however, were zombies shambling about. Nothing but the locals, and they're a good ways off, Johnson replied. Well, let's get inside before too many of them decide they want to pay us a visit, Copeland urged. He turned his attention back to the fence, pulling out a pair of wire cutters and quickly snapping links from the fence. After a few seconds, he had made a hole big enough for them to squeeze through. "We're in. Let's move," Copeland directed. The three of them got inside the perimeter of the fence, immediately hearing a loud clattering coming from their left. They turned and watched as a horde of ghouls pushed their way through the front gate, which had partially collapsed. "That's either a hell of a coincidence," Baker started, "or somebody was expecting us," Copeland finished. Copeland clicked on his communicator, yelling into it as the three of them ran across the parking lot towards the factory. "Kowalski, we got some trouble over here. What do you see?" "Still just the locals, Sarge. Nothing fast-moving or armed." "What are you seeing?" Kowalski responded, his voice tense. "The front gate just collapsed and let a whole mess of those things inside the perimeter," Copeland explained. Kowalski adjusted his aim, focusing on the front gate. His attention was drawn to a set of black tire marks on the ground just before the gate. Upon further inspection, he noted some damage on the portion that was still standing. "I think you can relax, Sarge. I don't believe this is a trap," Kowalski said. "You better be damn sure about that, Kowalski," Copeland warned. "It looks like someone slammed into the gate with their car at some point, and it did some damage to it. I don't think it was set up to fail," Kowalski explained. Copeland let out a sigh of relief as the three of them continued running up to the factory entrance, stopping 10 yards from the side door that led into a small office area. The sergeant turned and scanned the area, seeing dozens of zombies shambling inside the compound and spreading out, only a few of them having laid eyes on them. "Let's hope you're right, Kowalski. We're about to head inside. If you see anything, and I mean anything that looks suspicious, I want to be the first to know about it," Copeland instructed. "Copy that, Sarge," Kowalski replied. "And be ready to haul ass if this goes south, because we may not have time to wait at the rendezvous point," Copeland warned. "It wouldn't be the first time I've had to hitchhike home," Kowalski said. Copeland chuckled as he clicked off the communicator, turning to his comrades. "Okay, let's get inside." Chapter 2. Copeland moved up to the door of the office portion of the factory, peering through the glass into the darkened room. Much to his relief, he spotted no movement. "Baker, hit that glass," Sergeant Copeland ordered. The private stepped up, using the butt of his rifle to break out the glass before returning to his position. Copeland gave a quick glance inside to ensure that it was clear before reaching in and throwing the lock open. "We're in," Copeland confirmed. He readied his sidearm along with his knife, wanting to be prepared for anything as he led the trio inside. Johnson brought up the rear, securing the door as Baker pulled out a flashlight and began shining it around the small office area. The entire area looked virtually untouched from the pre-apocalypse days. Computers sat darkened in a handful of cubicles that were set up in the middle of the room, while the individual offices that lined the walls had their doors shut. The trio moved forward, with Johnson pulling out his flashlight as well. The two privates looked inside every office as they walked by, hoping to see something of value. Unfortunately, the only thing they saw was stacks of paperwork that were never to be finished. Copeland led them up to the door leading out of the offices and into the main section of the factory, stopping before opening the door to look out. The main floor was mostly bright as the sun came pouring in through the skylights above. "What do you see, Sarge?" Johnson asked. Copeland didn't answer as he continued staring out, his eyes straining to see into the shadows. After several moments, he finally spotted some movement, prompting him to pull back from the window. "I got movement," Sergeant Copeland reported. Both Johnson and Baker gripped their rifles a little tighter, ready for action should the need arise, while Copeland continued staring out onto the factory floor. After several moments, the source of the movement was revealed. A lone factory worker. The man was badly mangled, missing several chunks of flesh from his extremities, making it difficult for the creature to walk. As Copeland continued focusing on that ghoul, a couple more staggered out into the light, their faint moans echoing throughout the cavernous building. "I spot 3 of those things, which means there's probably more of them wandering around," Copeland said. "If those things are wandering around free in here, there's a good chance we're alone in here, right?" Baker asked. Copeland thought it over for a moment before nodding to Baker. "More than likely, but we need to stay alert. Now I want you two to cover the left side. I'm going straight ahead. Kill everything you come across and meet at the back wall, Copeland instructed. And if there's too many for us to handle? Johnson asked. Start shooting and retreat back to the offices. And stay on comms in case I have to call an audible, Sergeant Copeland replied. The three men nodded at each other before engaging in a group fist bump, then turned their attention to the door. Here we go, Copeland said. He threw open the office door, walking with purpose down the rightmost aisle of the warehouse. With his footsteps light, the former warehouse worker never saw him coming, the sergeant's knife slamming into the side of the ghoul's head. Copeland made sure to wrap the creature up with his free arm, gently lowering it to the ground in an attempt to minimize the noise. With that one taken care of, he turned his attention to the next two, which were 10 yards away. The sergeant walked towards them with no sense of urgency, cracking his neck as he drew closer. He let out a light clicking sound to get their attention. Yeah, come say hello, he taunted. The two ghouls let out a moan as they both shambled in his direction, lining up one right behind the other. Copeland moved to his right, getting the creatures to move with him. As he got within striking distance, the sergeant darted forward, grabbing the lead zombie by the shirt and driving it backward into the other one. The lightweight creatures were no match for the muscular sergeant, the force of his shove sending them both backward into the machinery. The ghouls flailed about as Copeland pressed his forearm deep into the chest of the lead zombie with enough force that its ribs began to crack. With the zombies pinned, Copeland had no problem ending their afterlife with a couple of well-placed stabs to the side of the head. Before he could let up pressure and drop them to the ground, he was startled when a series of gunshots echoed throughout the factory floor. Damn it, Copeland muttered. He stepped to the side of the ghouls, taking up some cover beside one of the large machines while he figured out where the shots were coming from. After several more went off in the distance, he managed to figure out they were originating from the same direction, a few yards back on the next aisle. Relieved that there didn't appear to be any return fire, Copeland got on the radio. Johnson, Baker, what in the hell is going on? Sergeant Copeland demanded. Several more seconds of rapid gunfire went off before silence fell over the factory floor. We're all good, Sarge, Johnson replied. What in the hell was all that? Copeland asked. Why don't you come over to our aisle and take a look for yourself, Johnson suggested. Copeland let out a huff as he pulled himself out from behind cover and began walking down the aisle in search of a crossover point. As he crossed over through the machinery and into the other aisle, he stopped abruptly as he spotted the cause of all the gunfire. A couple dozen corpses lay strewn about on the factory floor, with the two privates standing proudly on the other side of the carnage. I didn't hear any gunshots coming from your side of things, so I'm going to assume that you didn't have nearly as much fun as we did, Johnson remarked. Just a couple of close encounters, Copeland replied. He motioned for the duo to move towards him, which they did as they continued talking. As soon as we came around the corner, we were greeted by the welcoming committee, Baker explained. Where in the hell did they all come from? Sergeant Copeland asked. My guess is up there, Johnson said, pointing behind Copeland towards the middle part of the warehouse, where piles of camping gear sat, most of it unpacked. The sergeant stared at it for several moments, trying to make sense of it all. As horrible as all this is, it just might be the break we've been looking for, Copeland said. What makes you say that, Sarge? Baker asked. Because if there were this many of those things here, it's unlikely the Chosen or the militia came and cleared this place out, Copeland explained. The two privates exchanged a nod, hoping that the sergeant's suspicions were right. Come on, let's start checking for supplies, Copeland ordered. The others nodded as they fanned out and began inspecting the warehouse. 30 minutes went by, with the soldiers checking every box and room they came across, but to no avail. God damn it. Where in the hell is everything? Was this place not operational when all this bullshit started? Johnson exclaimed. He took out his frustrations on one of the corpses, delivering a forceful kick to the side of its head, snapping it to the side. You really need to get that temper under control, Johnson, Baker remarked. Private Johnson attempted to form words, but only frustrated gibberish managed to come out of his mouth. I couldn't have said it better myself, Baker quipped. Damn it, Baker. This doesn't make any sense. If this many of those things were in here, then how did anybody clean it out without laying a finger on them? Because I didn't see another body in this entire place. Johnson ranted. He let out his frustrations again by kicking another zombie in the head, the audible crack of its neck causing Baker to wince. Rather than look away, however, Baker began staring at the felled creature, a middle-aged man with a beard. I wonder, Baker mused. Wonder what? Johnson asked. Baker didn't respond as he pulled out his flashlight and began shining it on the corpses on the ground, confusing Johnson. He walked around to several of them, focusing on the corpses of the men while ignoring the women. So are you going to tell me what in the hell you are doing? Or do I have to guess? Johnson asked, clearly frustrated. I don't think this group has been in here all that long. Maybe a few weeks at most, Baker replied. And how did you come to that conclusion? Johnson questioned. Look at the men. Look at their faces. Every single one of them has a beard, Baker observed. Johnson let out an enthusiastic laugh, shaking his head and struggling to breathe for a moment before composing himself. You do know that this is Idaho, right? Hell, I'm pretty sure it was a state law that men had to have beards to live here, Johnson joked. That's cute, but I'm being serious. These aren't full beards, they're scruffy. Like someone wasn't able to shave for a few weeks, Baker explained. Johnson calmed down enough to pull out his flashlight and began shining it around on the faces of the male corpses. It took several moments before he began nodding slowly. Well, as stupid as that might sound, I think you might be right, Johnson conceded. What is Baker right about? Sergeant Copeland asked, startling Johnson as he spoke while coming around the corner. Christ, Sarge, maybe a little warning next time, Johnson replied, catching his breath. Sorry, but what's he right about? Copeland repeated. The men all have weak beards, like they just weren't able to shave for a few weeks. It could explain why they were in here and everything was gone, Baker elaborated. It's a solid theory, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter why. All that matters is that we came up mostly empty-handed, Copeland remarked. Both Baker and Johnson gave the sergeant a confused look. Mostly empty-handed? Johnson echoed. Copeland reached around his shoulder, pulling out a small leather document case and holding it up proudly. That's a solid-looking bag, Sergeant. The warm tones really bring out your eyes, Johnson teased. It's what's inside the bag, dumbass, Sergeant Copeland retorted. Baker let out a laugh at his friend's expense as Copeland opened up the bag and pulled out a handful of documents and a map. I found a corpse at the loading dock that had this bag on him. If I had to guess, I'd say he was one of the chosen, Copeland revealed. What makes you think that? Baker asked. He was better dressed than anybody in here, still had his gun too. And somebody shot him in the head after he was bitten, Copeland explained. So the chosen came here and cleaned the place out? Johnson asked. It would appear so. Luckily for us, whoever this guy was had intel on their entire operation, so maybe we can get lucky and find out where they took all this stuff, Copeland replied. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, but doesn't that sound a little too convenient? Baker asked. It does, but at this point we don't really have a choice, do we? Sergeant Copeland replied. Baker and Johnson exchanged glances before shrugging and nodding in agreement. So what now? Baker asked. We get the hell out of here, Copeland decided. He clicked his communicator on. Hey Kowalski, how are we looking out there? Copeland asked. The gate crashers are spread out all over the place, so it shouldn't be a problem to get back through the fence, Kowalski replied. Good, we're on the move. Once we're out of sight, get to the rendezvous point, Sergeant Copeland instructed. Copy that. Just make sure you have the car nice and toasty. I can't feel my fingers anymore, Kowalski said. You got it, Kowalski, Copeland confirmed. He clicked off the communicator before pulling out a larger walkie-talkie. Base, this is Alpha Team. We're on the way home. Chapter 3. Captain Kersey walked through the silent factory floor. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the bullet-making machines were last in operation, the need for them non-existent after running out of raw materials. The bags under the captain's eyes had become a constant feature, etched deeply into his face. The factory was designed for many things, but comfortable sleeping was not one of them. As he made his way toward the front of the building, Corporal Bretz called out, "Morning, Cap." "Morning, Bretz," Kersey replied, his voice heavy with fatigue. "I hope you have some good news for me." Bretz smirked. "So did you want to grab coffee before I started disappointing you? Or do you just want to dive in this morning?" Kersey let out a deep sigh, then motioned for the corporal to continue. "A couple of our scout teams got into some skirmishes with the militia," Bretz began. Kersey's face tightened with concern, but Bretz quickly raised his hands to stop him from speaking. "Relax, everyone's fine, at least on our side. But the men weren't able to finish scouting their areas." Kersey nodded, his expression grim. "We haven't found anything worthwhile in weeks. Unless they were playing defense, I can't imagine we would have found anything anyway." Bretz chuckled, though it held little humor. "That's the spirit, Kersey. Nothing like a little optimism to start the day off right." "Yeah, I know, Bretz. I should be the upbeat one. But my God, this whole mission has been an exercise in futility. What little we did manage to scrape together was stolen while in transport, and we haven't found squat since. Every single factory has been cleaned out, unless Copeland's team struck gold this morning." "And that's the other bit of news," Bretz added. "They're back already?" Kersey asked, a hint of hope in his voice. "Just rolled in a few minutes ago." "And what did they find?" "Nothing in the way of raw material," Bretz said, shaking his head. "That factory was just like the other 6 we've checked, completely cleaned out." "And the beat goes on," Kersey muttered. Bretz leaned in slightly. "They did find something of interest, though." Kersey stopped in his tracks, curiosity piqued. "What did they find?" "Come on. They're getting set up in the conference room." Kersey's pace quickened as he resumed walking, his excitement barely contained at the prospect of good news. Captain Kersey threw open the door to the conference room, startling Sergeant Copeland and the rest of his squad. "Tell me you have something good." "I just might, Cap," Sergeant Copeland responded, a small smile playing on his lips. "I just might." Kersey and Bretz took seats beside Copeland, who had a treasure trove of paperwork spread out in front of him. A map lay in the center of the table, its focus on downtown Boise, with a bright red circle drawn around Ontario in the northeastern corner. "As I'm sure you know by now," Copeland began, "the warehouse had been completely cleaned out. We're not entirely sure when it happened, but our best guess is a few weeks into the outbreak." "I'll take your word on that," Kersey said. "Continue." "During our search of the facility, I came across the body of who I suspect was a member of the Chosen. I found a bag filled with what you see here, lying beside him." Bretz leaned forward, examining the papers. "And what is all this?" "From what I've been able to gather so far," Copeland explained, "it's a manifest of everything his team had taken from the area." He reached down to a leather-bound notebook on the table and flipped through the pages. Kersey and Bretz crowded closer to inspect it as well. While the writing was hard to make out, it was clear that it was a list. "So what have you found on their list?" Kersey asked. "It's really hard to tell," Cap Copeland admitted, squinting at the pages. "I don't know what this guy did for a living, but I'm confident that it didn't involve legible penmanship. Regardless, this is the best lead we've had in weeks, and I think it's in our interest to check it out." Kersey reached down and adjusted the map, focusing intently on the bright red circle around the town of Ontario. "So what do we know about this place?" "Not much," Copeland replied. "Outside of that, it's just across the border on the other side of the river." "Why haven't we sent scouts up there yet?" Kersey asked. "We did, last week," Bretz said. "And what did they find?" Kersey prompted. "They didn't make it across the river due to how many of those things were clogging the streets," Bretz explained. "Did they find out anything useful about the town, or did they just take one look at the scene and nope out of there?" Before Bretz could answer, there was a knock at the door. Bretz stood up and opened it, accepting a file folder from another soldier. After a polite nod, he shut the door and began inspecting the contents. "Let's see," Bretz began, flipping through the pages. It's a decent-sized town of over 11,000. Not much of note in the majority of the town. Just the usual assortment of homes, strip malls, grocery stores. He trailed off, reading silently for a moment before continuing. Okay, here we go. There is an ammunition factory to the north of town that's situated in the middle of a large industrial zone. Does it say what else is up there? Kersey asked. Looks like a few other factories and a lot of warehouse space, Brett replied. Which would be the perfect place to set up if you wanted to consolidate your holdings, Copeland added. Plenty of space, easy access to a factory. And lots of locals to deter anybody from trying to take your stuff, Kowalski interjected. If there's that many of those things up there, then how in the hell were they moving through them? Johnson asked. As long as the driver was careful, a tractor trailer would be able to punch through a mob that size with little problem. Trust me on that, Brett assured him. Damn straight, Baker added, prompting the rest of the men to chuckle, remembering the trucker convoy through Seattle at the beginning of the invasion. Well, let's go get it then, Kersey declared. The others in the room glanced around at each other with worried looks, prompting confusion on Kersey's part. Or not. This is the biggest break we've had in weeks. What's the problem? Baker, do you want to field this one? Sergeant Copeland asked, turning to the private. All eyes fell onto Baker, who hesitated before speaking. It just feels all too convenient, Cap. The militia knows that we've been clearing the factories one by one, so they know that we'd eventually hit the one we did today. So you think one of them planted this information? Kersey asked, frowning. I mean, it's what I would do, Baker admitted. Getting in and out of that factory was low risk. And from the scout's description, Ontario sounds anything but low risk. One bridge across the river and thousands of those things roaming about. They wouldn't even need to set a trap for us. Just plant the bait and let us walk ourselves right into danger. Kersey stood there for a moment, a stern look on his face as he contemplated the situation. Copeland, you found the intel. What's your assessment? Did the scene look staged? My eyes tell me that it looked legit, Copeland replied cautiously. The dude got overrun by those things, and one of his partners took mercy on him with a shot to the head. However, I wouldn't put it past the militia to sacrifice someone just to make it look legit. Especially after what they did to the leader of the chosen, Kowalski added, his voice darkening. While I'm not going to lose sleep over that bastard's suffering, I have lost a few winks due to those pictures. Kersey fell silent again, running through every scenario he could think of. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. I understand the concerns, and after listening to you, I share them. I think there's a not insignificant chance that this is a deliberate trap. However, I also know that unless we're able to pull a rabbit out of the hat and get production going again, the militia is going to have the upper hand against our troops back in Seattle. All the hard work we did before was undone when the transport team didn't make it to Spokane. Kersey looked around the room at the other soldiers, and one by one, they nodded in agreement. What the hell, Kowalski said. It sounds more entertaining than just sitting around here waiting to be picked off by the militia. And it's not like we weren't going out into danger anyway, Baker added. The question is, how do we do it? Brett asked, looking toward Copeland. My team can get in there and find out what the situation is on the ground, Copeland offered. Thanks, Sarge, Johnson said sarcastically. Appreciate that vote of confidence. I just wish it was general praise and not volunteering us. I know it's a new concept for you, Johnson, Kowalski teased, but this is what happens when you're good at your job. You get more work. Johnson chuckled, playfully flipping Kowalski off. Okay, Sergeant. The job is yours, Kersey said, turning serious again. How do you want to proceed? Copeland pulled the map closer, studying it intently. It looks like there are 2 bridges over the river and into town. The interstate from the south is a no-go, most likely too many cars and too wide open. He focused on the bridge on the eastern side of town, staring at it for several moments before shaking his head. Hey, Brett, when the scouts showed up, they came in from the east, didn't they? Brett grabbed the scout's report, giving it a once-over before nodding. So the bridge to the east isn't viable either, Copeland concluded, which means we're going to have to go with a water crossing. Nothing like joining the Polar Bear Club before an ambush, Kersey muttered. Don't worry, Kowalski, Brett said with a grin. I'm pretty sure there's a raft around here somewhere. Where in the hell did we get a raft from? Johnson asked, bewildered. One of the scouting targets was on the other side of that lake we landed in when we got here, Brett explained. It was safer to cross it than go in directly, and they kept it. Well, damn, Kowalski muttered. What are you mad about? Kowalski, Copeland asked with a smirk. You don't have to go swimming now. Yeah, but we just used up our good luck for the mission. I hate it when that happens right out of the gate, Kowalski grumbled. Copeland just shook his head as he turned back to the captain. We'll get across there and see what the situation is. If it looks like the real deal, we'll figure out what we need to do from there. And if it's the trap we all think it is, Baker asked. Then I'll lead the charge to come get you myself, Kersey declared, surprising the men with his resolve. Copeland blinked in surprise. Captain, are you sure that's wise? Most of the men in here don't have that much combat experience, at least not against trained soldiers, Kersey explained. Besides, we've kicked over every stone in the city and haven't come up with anything. If this doesn't pan out, then our mission here is pretty much over. So if you get in trouble, we're going to come get you out of it. Copeland nodded, appreciating the captain's commitment, before looking around at the rest of his team. Okay, boys, gear up. We're moving in 20. Chapter 4. Sergeant Copeland led Kowalski, Baker, and Johnson towards the river on foot, having left their vehicle a half-mile behind them. The hike through the open terrain had been a chore, especially while lugging a small rubber raft with them, but they knew that making too much noise could potentially make a crossing impossible. As they approached the riverbank, the group spotted a cluster of trees and took cover behind it. Kowalski let go of the raft as the group dropped it to the ground, the sniper collapsing into it, completely out of breath. You know, Sarge, Kowalski said between labored breaths, I just wanted to thank you again for volunteering us for this detail. I'm just looking out for your well-being, Kowalski, Sergeant Copeland replied, a hint of dry humor in his voice. How in God's name is this good for my well-being? Kowalski asked, incredulous. Copeland smirked. You're a free spirit, Kowalski, and if you had to spend another day cooped up inside that factory, it might have pushed you over the edge. Kowalski let out a sigh in response, too out of breath to form more words. Okay, boys, let's see what we're dealing with, Sergeant Copeland ordered. Copeland moved up towards the edge of the trees, pulling out binoculars as he did so. Baker and Johnson flanked him, each with their own set of binoculars. All three men let out deep sighs as the town on the other side of the water came into view. The row of businesses along the waterfront stretched on for a mile, with hundreds of zombies milling about in the area. Well, that's a problem, Johnson remarked. Maybe if we moved further north before crossing? Baker suggested. According to the scouts, Copeland responded, there's a huge mob in that area, and not much in the way of cover outside of the building they were attracted to. At least here we have some options. Yeah, Johnson muttered, some options of where we want to get stuck. Before Copeland could respond, Kowalski joined them on the line. With a light smack on Baker's arm, the private handed over his binoculars for the sniper to look through. At the first sight of the creatures, Kowalski let out an impressed whistle. That's quite the crowd, Kowalski said, shaking his head. We'll be all right, Copeland reassured them. We're going to cross, stay on this side of the buildings, and get up towards the north. It shouldn't be more than a few miles. To where the mob that's so big we can't cross is. Baker asked skeptically. If we're moving quietly and quickly enough, Copeland explained, we should be able to get by them. Assuming the scouting report is accurate. Because those always are, Johnson muttered under his breath. We'll be all right, Copeland repeated. Guess I better get stretching then, because that's going to be a hell of a run, Baker sighed. What if we drove instead? Kowalski suggested. All three of the soldiers turned towards Kowalski with confused looks etched onto their faces. And what if we sprouted wings and just flew there? Johnson quipped. I'm serious, Johnson. I think I found us a vehicle, Kowalski insisted. Even if there was one we could get to, that battery is long gone, Baker argued. 2 months sitting idle, we'd be lucky to get the dash lights to come on, let alone getting it to turn over. It's a good thing it's at the mechanic then, Kowalski said with a smirk. Kowalski handed the binoculars back to Baker, who joined the others in looking back across the river. Straight across from us, then 2 blocks to the north, Kowalski instructed. The men all followed the sniper's directions, honing in on the mechanic's shop. Well, I'll be damned, Sergeant Copeland muttered. On the corner sat a mechanic's shop with an open bay door, a shiny red SUV sitting just outside in the parking lot. A dozen zombies milled about in the general area, their focus drawn in multiple directions. I've heard worse ideas, especially from you, Kowalski, Baker admitted. I figure we can get in through the open bay door, grab one of those battery jumpers, and we're on the road, Kowalski explained. Do you think the gas is still good in it? Johnson asked. It's 50-50, Copeland replied, but I think it's worth the risk. That's a good find, Kowalski. The sniper nodded to the sergeant as the group got themselves into battle mode. As soon as we're clear of the trees, we haul ass to the river, Sergeant Copeland directed. We get across and up to the shop. Kowalski, you're going to find what we need to get that SUV going. Baker, you're on key duty. They should be in one of the packets at the front desk. While you do that, Johnson and I will keep the crowd occupied. The 3 soldiers nodded to Copeland, who extended his fist for a group bump before motioning back towards the raft. Let's do this, Copeland commanded. All 4 men positioned themselves around the raft, gripping it tightly as they emerged from the trees. Once everyone was clear, they moved as a single unit, legs pumping as they sprinted across the open field towards the river. In a matter of moments, they reached the water, skillfully tossing the raft into the river and jumping in. Johnson and Baker grabbed the oars, paddling with intensity as they quickly traversed the river. The foursome reached the opposite bank, which had a slight incline leading to the road. Their boots splashing down in the shallow water drew the attention of a handful of creatures on the bank. With a collective moan, the trio of ghouls shambled towards them, losing their balance on the incline and tumbling down into the water, narrowly missing the soldiers as they went by. Baker, Johnson, get up that incline and start cracking skulls, Sergeant Copeland ordered. The 2 privates nodded and broke from the raft, quickly ascending the incline with their knives at the ready. Johnson barely got a single step on level ground before a zombie lunged for him. With a deft duck down, the soldier avoided being grabbed, allowing him to plant his shoulder into the midsection of the creature. Up you go. Johnson grunted as he lifted the zombie up before slamming it headfirst into the hard ground, snapping its neck. Baker, meanwhile, was busy delivering head strikes with his knife, dispatching a couple of creatures in rapid succession and giving the soldiers some breathing room from the welcoming committee. Copeland and Kowalski joined them at the top of the incline, both of them blowing right by the 2 privates as they rushed towards the mechanic's shop. Let's clear the way, Sergeant Copeland urged. Copeland picked up a head of steam, lowering his shoulder and plowing through a couple of creatures that were shambling in his direction. As the others followed, their collective footsteps on the pavement drew the attention of the zombies in the area. Within seconds, a chorus of moans filled the air as more and more zombies took notice of them. None of that concerned Copeland, who continued to plow through zombies on his way towards the mechanic's shop. As he reached the parking lot, the sergeant finally drew his knife, rushing up towards the closest creature and driving it deep into its skull. Rather than let it drop to the ground, he grabbed it by the throat, lifting it off its feet and shoving it towards 2 other nearby zombies. The weight of the lifeless corpse was more than enough to knock the 2 zombies backward to the ground. Copeland wasted no time in rushing up to them, delivering forceful head strikes with his knife. Kowalski, Baker, get our ride going. We'll hold them off, Sergeant Copeland commanded. Copeland stared out towards the mass of ghouls that were shambling in their direction as Kowalski and Baker rushed by them. A few seconds later, Johnson took up position beside the sergeant, both of them having their knives at the ready. Hit them hard and hit them fast. We don't have to take them all out, just keep them occupied, Sergeant Copeland ordered. Johnson nodded as the 2 soldiers let out a grunt before rushing towards the front edge of the horde. Meanwhile, Kowalski and Baker rushed inside the mechanics through the open bay door. Find those keys and get the hood open. Kowalski instructed urgently. Before Baker could respond, he was greeted by a zombie lunging at him from the darkness. His instinct took over, swinging the knife upwards as hard as he could, managing to catch the creature underneath its jaw. The ghoul stumbled for a second before dropping to the ground, the knife sliding cleanly out in the process. "I'm on it," Baker replied. "Just make sure you can start it up." Kowalski nodded as he pulled out his flashlight, shining it around the small mechanic's bay. Come on, where are you hiding?" Kowalski muttered to himself. The light scanned the back wall of the shop, quickly darting from the shelves to the floor, revealing nothing but collections of tools and various car necessities like oil and air filters. "Damn it. Come on, you have to have one of these," Kowalski grumbled. He abandoned the back wall, focusing his attention on the area in between the two bay doors. He shoved tools and various other things out of the way in his frantic search, finally dropping to one knee and looking underneath the table. "Now we're cooking," Kowalski exclaimed as he reached out and grabbed the small battery device, which wasn't much bigger than a car battery. As he stood up, he spotted Baker, who was coming out from the front part of the store carrying a handful of clear plastic pouches. "The keys have to be in one of these," Baker said as he handed one over. Kowalski nodded as he strained, lifting up the heavy battery and following his comrade back out into the parking lot. The sniper set the device on the ground, picking up the leads and getting them ready. "Anytime now, Baker," Kowalski urged. Private Baker reached into the first pouch, hitting the unlock button on the keys found inside. When nothing happened, he dropped the pouch and went into the next one. After several of these, he finally found the correct set. With a satisfying thunk, the locks on the SUV unlatched, allowing him access. "We're in," Baker announced as he quickly popped the hood and helped Kowalski attach the leads to the battery. "Get inside and start turning that key," Kowalski ordered. Baker did as instructed, hopping into the driver's seat and turning the key. The engine whined for several seconds before ultimately not starting. "We need to give it a minute to charge," Baker called out. "Damn it," Kowalski cursed. Kowalski turned around to see Johnson and Copeland engaged in hand-to-hand combat with the encroaching mob of zombies. While they were holding their own against the front line of the creatures, a logjam of them was beginning to form just a few yards back. Kowalski moved with haste, drawing his handgun and positioning himself to the side of the other two soldiers. Without warning, he began firing, squeezing the trigger quickly and dropping ghouls just behind the front line with ease. He finally paused after emptying half a magazine, prompting Copeland to yell out. "What in the hell are you doing, Kowalski?" Sergeant Copeland demanded. "We needed a minute, and it didn't look like we had one," Kowalski explained. Copeland nodded before returning to the fight. Kowalski fired several more times, helping to stem the tide of creatures from overwhelming his friends. The fight was soon interrupted by the sound of the SUV's horn honking. "We're rolling," Baker shouted from inside the vehicle. Kowalski sprinted back to the SUV, yanking the connectors from the battery and grabbing the jumpstart device. As he jumped into the back of the vehicle, the other two soldiers joined him. "We're in. Get us the hell out of here," Sergeant Copeland commanded. Baker didn't waste time, putting the SUV into drive and hitting the gas. The vehicle lurched forward as he peeled out from the parking space and onto the road. The soldiers bounced around the interior of the SUV as they smacked up against zombies that were attempting to grasp at them. After a few seconds, however, they were in the clear, with enough space between the zombies that Baker was able to steer around them. "Well, that was fun," Johnson remarked, catching his breath. "Is everybody okay?" Sergeant Copeland asked. "Yeah, we're good, Sarge," Kowalski confirmed. "All right then. Baker, start heading north," Sergeant Copeland instructed. "Copy that, Sarge," Baker replied, focusing on the road ahead. Chapter 5. Baker kept the pedal to the metal, speeding around the northern part of the town toward the industrial district. While the streets themselves were mostly clear of zombies, hundreds stretched down side streets and into the fields to the north. "Mother of God," Kowalski muttered. "That must be the horde the scouts were talking about." Copeland and Johnson looked north toward a writhing mass of rotting flesh clustered by a building just off the river. Johnson squinted, confusion evident on his face. "What the hell is that place?" "It's right on the river," Kowalski replied. "Could be boat rental? Fishing supplies? Who knows? All I know is, I don't want to drive up there and find out." "Ain't that the truth?" Johnson agreed. Baker, gripping the wheel, glanced at Copeland. "Do you have any idea where I'm going, Sarge?" Copeland went back to studying the map as closely as he could, pulling out a small magnifying glass to get a better idea of where the target was and how to get there. "This circle is pretty damn big," Sergeant Copeland said, "but best I can tell, it's another mile up." "Jesus," Johnson whispered. Kowalski shook his head. "Yeah, Sarge, let's hope you're reading that wrong, because a mile is not a lot of space between us and the fishing horde." Sergeant Copeland's expression hardened. "It just means that we're going to have to move fast, Kowalski." Kowalski and Johnson shared a concerned look, knowing that as soon as they fired off a single shot, the mob would start shambling in their direction. "Hey, Sarge, I think we're here," Baker announced, breaking the tension. Copeland looked up from his map as the soldiers in the back seat leaned toward the middle to see out the front. A few hundred yards up were several warehouses that lined the road, with a few dozen more just beyond them, stretching in all directions. Johnson's eyes widened. "How in the hell are we supposed to find them in here?" "Baker, pull in between those first two buildings and park it," Sergeant Copeland ordered. Baker hesitated. "You want to walk it?" "We have to assume that this place is still guarded by chosen members," Sergeant Copeland explained. "Do you really want to let them know that we're here?" Baker let out a long sigh before shaking his head and following the sergeant's orders. "Well, what's a little more cardio?" Baker pulled the SUV to a stop in the road between two warehouses. A handful of zombies took notice and began wandering in their direction, with a few more emerging from behind parked transfer trucks docked in the bays. "Kowalski, get up top and see what you can see," Sergeant Copeland commanded. "We'll handle the company." "I'm on it, Sarge," Kowalski replied, throwing open the door, slinging his sniper rifle over his shoulder, and jogging down the road. As Kowalski approached the first truck, a zombie came staggering out from the other side. However, he paid the ghoul no attention, simply darting around it and continuing on. 30 yards down, above one of the parked trucks, Kowalski spotted a ladder that had been bolted onto the side of the building, stretching down toward one of the parked trucks. "Bingo," he muttered to himself. Kowalski picked up the pace, jumping onto the back bumper of the truck and grabbing onto the railing that ran vertically alongside it. A few seconds later, the sniper managed to scale it, rolling onto the roof of the truck. As he got to his feet, he glanced back and watched as Copeland rushed up and began slamming the zombie's head into the back bumper of the truck. "Well, that was graphic," Kowalski muttered, shaking off the violent imagery. He turned his attention to the ladder on the side of the building. While it was a few feet off the top of the truck, he had no problem jumping up and grabbing onto the bottom rung. Upon reaching the roof, Kowalski rolled to the ground, wanting to remain out of sight in case someone was watching. He pulled his rifle around, peering through the scope to get a lay of the land. To the north of their position lay half a dozen more warehouses, stretching on straight down the road. At the far end of the row stood a giant factory, taking up both sides of the road. "That's got to be the ammo factory," Kowalski murmured to himself. "Now, where are you hiding the goods at?" Kowalski scanned the rooftops of the other warehouses that stretched out all around them, thinking aloud as he did so. These assholes were a lot of things, but stupid wasn't one of them. So they're not going to be hiding the stuff at the factory, right? Surely they had to suspect somebody was going to come by eventually. As the sniper continued to scan, he stopped abruptly at movement on a rooftop. "Well, what do we have here?" Kowalski adjusted the magnification on his scope to get a better view. At the far corner of one of the warehouses, he could see a figure wrapped up in a sleeping bag, sitting up straight and barely moving. "So are you alive?" Kowalski whispered to himself. "Or are you just one of those things wrapped up like a burrito?" Kowalski continued staring at the figure, looking for anything that would tell him if it was alive or dead. Finally, he spotted it, a small cloud of vapor, as the hot breath met the cold air. "I got you," Kowalski said, making a mental note of the warehouse, which was 3 rows down. Before coming back down, he scanned the rest of the rooftops but found nothing. Kowalski made his way back down to the road below, pausing at the top of the truck to watch Sergeant Copeland crack a couple more heads. Once the coast was clear, the sniper climbed down and joined his squad. Sergeant Copeland looked at him expectantly. "What do you have for me, Kowalski?" "There is one very cold rooftop guard 3 rows up," Kowalski reported. "Good work." "Did you spot anything else?" Copeland asked. "I'm pretty sure that building at the end of the road here is the ammo factory," Kowalski replied. "It's bigger than anything else here." Sergeant Copeland nodded. "One thing at a time." He let out a clicking sound to get the attention of the other privates, motioning for them to move back to the vehicle. "Okay, we have our target 3 rows up," Sergeant Copeland said. "There's 1 guard on the roof, so we have to assume there's more inside." Johnson, always the practical one, asked, "So what's the play?" "We're moving up 2 rows, Sergeant Copeland explained. "Then we're going to breach the warehouse across from them. Reevaluate from there." "What about those things wandering around?" Baker asked, motioning to the zombies nearby. "Just push through them," Sergeant Copeland replied. "Depending on what we find in that warehouse, they might come in handy." Johnson frowned. "You're expecting us to be outmanned?" Sergeant Copeland met his gaze steadily. "With the way this week has gone, are you expecting anything else?" Johnson cracked a smile, nodding to the sergeant. "Get your gear. Let's move out," Sergeant Copeland ordered. The men nodded before moving to the back of the SUV, popping open the hatch and loading up with gear. While the majority of the ammunition had been lost in transport to Spokane, Captain Kersey had been smart enough to hold back a significant amount for his men. As a result, all 4 soldiers were loaded for bear. Once the men were ready, Copeland moved them out, taking point as the rest of them fell into line behind him. The group moved with haste, staying close to the side of the warehouses as they went. Copeland held the men up at the edge of the first building, looking both directions before crossing. He motioned for the men to move quietly, as a few dozen zombies were stretched out over the length of a warehouse in each direction. The men softened their movement as they crossed, relieved not to hear a chorus of moans following them as they continued moving up. A few moments later, they found themselves outside the warehouse directly across from the target. While it was locked up tightly with all the bay doors closed, there were some offices on the corner with a glass door leading inside. "Johnson, get that door open quietly," Sergeant Copeland instructed. Johnson nodded and took point, darting out and running across the open space toward the door, while the others trailed behind him. As the private's footsteps echoed slightly in the empty space, a few zombies took notice, letting out moans as they shambled out from behind a nearby truck. Copeland smacked Baker on the arm, motioning for him to follow before telling Kersey to follow Johnson. The sergeant led the charge toward the 4 zombies that were packed tightly together just behind the truck. Copeland picked up steam, lowering his shoulder and plowing through them, sending bodies flying in every direction. As he turned around, he spotted Baker driving his knife into one of the fallen ghouls. Copeland quickly joined the fray, drawing his knife and attacking one of the other fallen creatures. Within seconds, the threat had been neutralized. The 2 men ran back to the door, where Johnson had managed to break the lock and get it open. "I'm taking point and going to make a play for the door to the warehouse," Sergeant Copeland said. "I want you 3 to clear out everything behind me." The men all nodded in agreement as Copeland breached the building, his knife and flashlight at the ready. As he entered the office area, which ran for a good 50 yards along the backside of the building, he moved with haste toward the warehouse entrance. Copeland ran down the aisle between a line of cubicles and small offices. As he went, he kept his head on a swivel, trying to spot any signs of trouble. Much to his relief, he didn't see any movement, nor signs of struggle. Within seconds, he was at the door to the warehouse, which remained closed. He checked the lock, seeing it was secure before turning around to face whatever threats he may have overlooked. Instead, he was greeted with his squad strolling through the office area. "Looks like we're clear then?" Sergeant Copeland asked. Johnson shrugged. "I don't think anybody's been in here in months." Kowalski walked up to the door leading to the warehouse, unlocking it and peeking through the crack. He let out a chuckle as he threw the door completely open. "I think it might be longer than that," Kowalski remarked. The rest of the men looked through the door, seeing that the entire space was empty, prompting everyone to let their guard down. "I guess they were just getting set up when everything ended," Baker mused. "That's good for us because we know nothing's hiding in there," Johnson added. Kowalski turned to Copeland. "So what's the play, Sarge?" Copeland stepped into the vacant warehouse space, looking around to get the lay of the land. A row of bay doors sat closed directly across from them and right in front of the target. Against the wall was a ladder that stretched all the way up to a hatch leading to the roof. "Kowalski, I want you up top," Sergeant Copeland instructed. "When we're ready to move, I want you to take out our rooftop neighbor, then cover us while we investigate." "You don't want me over there with you?" Kowalski asked. "No, I'm going to need your eye in the sky," Sergeant Copeland explained. "If that guard has friends inside, we're going to be making a lot of noise and drawing attention our way." "You got it, Sarge," Kowalski agreed. "Okay, men, let's move like we have a purpose." Chapter 6. Kowalski paused at the top of the ladder, gathering himself before opening the hatch to the roof. He took a deep breath and steadied himself. "Okay, Sarge, I'm in position," he said into his communicator. "Stand by," Sergeant Copeland replied. Copeland, Johnson, and Baker stood by the bay door on the corner of the building, peering out through the narrow crack between it and the track on the wall. The tension was palpable, and the air was thick with anticipation. "What do you see?" Johnson asked, breaking the silence. Copeland squinted, assessing the scene. "It's about a 40-yard run to the target, and there's a lot of corpses on the ground between here and there, so watch your step." Baker glanced nervously at the door. "I can't imagine it's just one dude on the roof taking that many things down." Copeland nodded in agreement. "I tend to agree, which is why we're going to be going in hot. We have to assume that when Kowalski knocks out their rooftop guard, they're going to be onto us." Johnson motioned for Copeland to step aside so he could get a better look outside. Straight across from them was a row of bay doors, with the one on the corner having a ramp leading right up to it. However, to the right, he noticed that one of the bay doors was open slightly, just a couple of feet. "I think I found our way inside," Johnson said, stepping back and pointing to the right so that Copeland could easily spot it. "Given how stuffy it is in here, I can see why they left the door cracked," Copeland remarked. "At least they'll have some fresh air while we're putting them down." "So no prisoners?" Baker asked, a hint of concern in his voice. Copeland's expression hardened. "These people enslaved others who were just looking for help and killed those who refused. I think we should show them all the courtesy they deserve." "So no prisoners then?" Baker repeated, this time with a bit more resolve. "We're going to move quick, get inside, and do a little misdirection," Copeland instructed. "I want you two getting to the exterior wall towards the offices." "What are you going to do?" Johnson inquired. "I'm going to find myself a nice hiding spot while they converge on you, then introduce myself," Copeland replied with a grim smile. Baker let out a small chuckle as he and Johnson exchanged a fist bump. Just once it would be nice to not be the bait, he mused. "Maybe one day, Baker, but not today," Copeland said as he walked over to the regular-sized door beside the bay entrance. He gently turned the deadbolt, minimizing the audible thunk. "Hey, Kowalski," Copeland called into his communicator. "We know what we're doing and we're in position. We move on your mark." "Copy that, Sarge." 60 seconds, Kowalski responded, his voice steady despite the tension. Kowalski looked up at the hatch to the roof, taking a moment to steady himself before reaching up for the release. He twisted it to the side, unlatching it but hesitating. "Please be looking away, please be looking away," he muttered to himself. With a grunt, Kowalski pushed the heavy metal hatch upwards, flinging it open. The door slammed onto the top of the roof, making a louder than expected noise that sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. He moved as fast as he could, quickly ascending the ladder and getting low so that the lip of the roof would provide him with some cover. Without wasting a moment, he slung the rifle off his shoulder and scanned the other rooftop. "Damn it," he cursed under his breath as he saw the bundled-up guard beginning to stir, startled by the sudden loud noise. Fortunately for Kowalski, the guard was wrapped up snugly in his sleeping bag, making him easy prey. "At least you're going to die warm," Kowalski muttered as he got the man in his sights. He squeezed the trigger, sending a well-placed round right into the man's chest. The figure fell lifeless onto the rooftop, but Kowalski kept his aim on him for several moments, making sure he was indeed down for the count. Once he was satisfied, he clicked on his communicator. "You're clear, Sarge." "Go," Kowalski confirmed. Copeland burst through the door as soon as he heard Kowalski's voice, leading the charge across the open area towards the other warehouse. The trio rushed across the road, navigating through the maze of corpses on the ground. As they got within 15 yards of the partially open bay door, they noticed it was beginning to inch closed. A split second later, a man took a knee at the corner, aiming a hunting rifle in their direction. Copeland raised his rifle and squeezed the trigger several times, his aim panicked. While the bullets missed the man, they were close enough to force him back behind cover. The impact caused the door to stop moving just long enough for Copeland to reach it. Rather than wait at the base of the truck bay to clear the area, Copeland leapt up as he got close. His jump was forceful enough to propel him inside the warehouse, sliding along on his stomach across the floor for several inches. For a brief moment, his eyes met the armed man's, and Copeland could see the bewildered terror in the man's gaze. While the man's reaction was delayed due to his inexperience, Copeland's multiple deployments had removed any hesitation. With a squeeze of the trigger, Copeland sent a single round through the man's chest, splattering blood onto his partner who was just behind him, trying to lower the door with the chain. Copeland quickly adjusted his aim, firing off another shot and putting down the other man before he had a chance to reach for his weapon. The sergeant then popped up to one knee, sweeping both directions for more threats but finding none. "Come on, get in here," Copeland called out, his voice urgent. Johnson and Baker took a few seconds to climb in through the open bay door as Copeland continued his watch. In the distance, they could hear several sets of footsteps running, along with some yelling, all of it coming from one direction. "You boys get a move on. I'll see you in a minute," Copeland ordered, vanishing into the shadows cast by the large stacks of boxes in the middle of the warehouse. "I guess that's our cue," Johnson said, glancing at Baker. Baker nodded, and the two men took off running away from the yelling and footsteps, both of them spreading out enough so that if someone took a shot at them, they'd have a tougher time picking a target. They didn't have to wait long. Several gunshots echoed from the opposite side of the warehouse, the bullets whizzing by the two soldiers as they ran. "Move up," Johnson yelled out, spinning around and firing several rounds downrange. He wasn't aiming at anything in particular, just trying to buy them a few seconds to make it to proper cover. After shooting, he took off running again, allowing Baker to provide cover fire. Their shots were essentially firing into the darkness at the far end of the warehouse, but it did the job of stopping the return fire. The two of them made it to the back wall of the building, spotting the door to the offices in the middle. As they ran up, a man opened the door, gun in hand, drawn to the noise and commotion. Johnson didn't break stride as he lowered his shoulder and slammed into the door, the heavy wood cracking the man in the face and sending him to the ground. Before Johnson could raise his rifle and finish the job, a bullet ripped through the door, grazing his arm. Instinct took over, and Johnson dropped to the ground as more bullets tore through the wooden door. Raising his rifle, he fired several shots through the lower portion of the door towards an unseen enemy, sparing a brief moment to adjust his aim and put two into the chest of the wounded man just off to his side. Johnson rolled over to his stomach, positioning himself at the side of the door, gently pulling it open. It only moved a few inches before more bullets ripped through the top portion of it again, the muzzle flashes inside the darkened office drawing Johnson's attention and giving him a target to fire at. With 3 quick trigger pulls, the man inside the office collapsed to the ground in a heap, his breathing ragged as blood clogged his airway. "We gotta move," man Baker urged, rushing into the office. Johnson quickly scrambled to his feet and joined him, just as bullets flew from the side, slamming into the door as he cleared the threshold. Both men did a quick sweep of the small office area, which consisted of little more than a handful of cubicles that had been turned into a makeshift sleeping area. With nobody else in sight, they took up positions behind cover, aiming their guns toward the door. "You're hit," Baker pointed out, noticing the blood on Johnson's arm. "It's just a flesh wound. I'll be all right," Johnson assured him, trying to focus. Baker was concerned but put it aside, focusing on the door. The duo could hear movement outside, footsteps and murmuring to go along with ammunition being loaded into rifles. "As soon as you see that door move, you unload on them," Johnson instructed. "We just have to keep them busy for the Sarge." As if on cue, Copeland emerged from his hiding spot between stacks of boxes, his assault rifle at the ready, as he moved silently to the back wall of the building. His movements were swift and deliberate, knowing that an attack on his men was imminent. The sergeant made his way to the office side of the building, pausing at the edge of a stack of boxes to survey the situation. He spotted 4 men, 2 on either side of the door, all of them clutching their rifles tightly and debating who would make the first move through the door. It took a few moments of indecision before one man was volunteered. Despite being 20 yards away, Copeland could hear the man sigh heavily, the reluctance evident in his demeanor. With the barrel of his rifle, the man began to pull the door open ever so slightly. It didn't move more than 6 inches before a barrage of bullets ripped through it, forcing him back in a panic. The others immediately focused on the man, checking to see if he was all right. It was the opportunity Copeland had been waiting for. Stepping out from behind cover, he took aim at one of the men and squeezed the trigger. The bullet tore through the man's chest, dropping him to the ground. Before his body hit the concrete floor, Copeland had already fired another round into the man standing next to him. The 2 remaining men had barely registered what was happening when Copeland's rifle barked twice more, each shot finding its mark with lethal precision. Within seconds, the scene fell eerily quiet. The 4 men lay motionless, their blood pooling on the cold, unforgiving floor. Copeland moved cautiously, stepping over the bodies as he approached the office door, his rifle still at the ready. He spotted one of the downed men struggling weakly, trying to grasp his rifle. "Oh no, you don't," Copeland muttered as he delivered a final shot, ensuring the man wouldn't pose a threat. Satisfied that the immediate area was secure, Copeland kicked away the remaining weapons before knocking on the office door. "You boys all right in there?" he called out, his voice calm and authoritative. "Yeah, we're good," Sarge Johnson replied, his tone steady despite the chaos they had just endured. "Well, come on out then. We have a lot of work to do and not much time to do it." Chapter 7. Copeland, Baker, and Johnson had swept the entire length of the warehouse, meticulously checking every aisle between boxes, listening intently for any potential stragglers. As they found no one in their search, they began to relax, all except for Johnson, who took it upon himself to yell out a threat. "All right, assholes, listen up. If there's anybody left alive in here, and you're thinking of ambushing us, just know that we're cold, tired, hungry, and have been bored out of our ever-loving minds for the last few weeks. So make no mistake about it, if you take a shot at us, we're going to enjoy ourselves at your expense." As Johnson stood there, a smug look on his face, both Baker and Copeland exchanged confused glances. "What?" Johnson asked, noticing their expressions. "I want them to know we're not to be messed with." "By threatening to sexually assault them," Baker responded, eyebrows raised in disbelief. "What? No. I mean, we're going to rough them up, break a few bones, stuff like that," Johnson hastily clarified. "That's not how it came off," Baker retorted, still skeptical. "You can't be serious, Baker." "Come on, Sarge, back me up here," Johnson pleaded, turning to Copeland. Copeland merely cocked his head to the side and shrugged, offering no support. "Oh, for the love of God," Johnson sighed before yelling out again. "Just to be clear, we're not going to violate you, just break some bones and stuff like that." Johnson looked back at his 2 squad mates. "Is that better?" "I feel better," Baker said with a nod. "Sarge?" Copeland could only roll his eyes before clicking on his communicator. "Kowalski, do you copy?" Copeland asked, his tone serious. "Loud and clear, Sarge." "How are you looking in there?" Kowalski's voice crackled over the radio. "We cleared out the Chosen, and there's a lot of stuff to go through," Copeland replied, scanning the warehouse. "Well, you better hurry it up because all that gunfire got the attention of the locals," Kowalski warned. "How bad is it?" Copeland asked. "Best I can tell, there's 50 to 60 of those things coming around the building, and another 100 or so are starting to come our way from down the street," Kowalski reported. What about that mob we drove by? Copeland asked. Stand by, Kowalski responded before pausing the conversation. He turned and walked to the other side of the rooftop, making some adjustments to his scope until it was at maximum magnification. Once in position, he aimed back towards the road they had come in on, peering into the distance. While it was difficult to make out in detail, he could see a large mass on the road, appearing to head in their direction. Hey, Sarge, it looks like we got some of their attention, Kowalski said, his voice tense. Damn it. How loud were those gunshots? Copeland asked, his frustration evident. They didn't sound too bad from where I was standing, and I can't imagine my one shot got their attention. Maybe some of them spotted us driving in and started a conga line? Kowalski speculated. Possibly. I want you to stay on top of them and let me know when they're within a quarter mile, Copeland instructed. Copy that. Kowalski acknowledged. Oh, and you have the big radio, right? Copeland added. Yeah, I got it. Do you want me to let Cap know what's up? Kowalski asked. If you don't mind, Copeland responded. Will do, Sarge. Good luck and hope you find something, Kowalski signed off. You and me both, Copeland muttered as the line went dead. Kowalski reached into a small bag on his hip, pulling out a larger walkie-talkie. It took him a moment to power it on and get the right frequency dialed in. Captain Kersey, it's Kowalski. Do you copy? Kowalski called out, his voice calm but focused. Give me some good news, Kowalski. Kersey's voice came through, tinged with hope. We've secured the warehouse. Copeland, Johnson, and Baker are going through the inventory now, Kowalski reported. That sounds hopeful, Kersey replied. Better than anything we've come across in recent weeks, Kowalski agreed. Fingers crossed for some ammunition materials, Kersey said. I wouldn't be mad at a couple of boxes of snack cakes, Kowalski quipped, earning an audible laugh from the captain over the radio. Never change, Kowalski, never change, Kersey chuckled. I wouldn't dream of it, Cap, Kowalski responded with a grin. So, what's your transportation situation looking like? Kersey asked. I think a polite way of putting it is that it's less than ideal, Kowalski admitted. How bad is it? Kersey pressed. Well, we managed to borrow someone's SUV, but we haven't found anything big enough to move weight. So if you have any bright ideas, I'm open to them, Kowalski explained. Can you get stuff to the river? Maybe we could. Kersey began, but Kowalski cut him off. Well, Cap, that's the other problem we're facing. We may have inadvertently drawn a few thousand of those things in our direction, Kowalski confessed. There was a long pause on the radio before Kersey spoke up again. How did you manage to accomplish that? I'll be honest with you, Cap. I don't know. We were a good quarter mile from the back end of the mob when we drove by. And I've only fired one shot from a mile and a half away. It doesn't make any sense, Kowalski replied, frustration seeping into his voice. That doesn't sound right, Kersey said, clearly puzzled. Tell me about it. Everything we know about these things tells me they shouldn't be headed our way, but when I look through my scope, there they are, Kowalski said, still trying to make sense of the situation. What about other movement? Kersey asked. We have some of the locals shambling our way, but nothing we can't handle, Kowalski answered. I mean, are they all coming in your direction? Kersey clarified. Kowalski was confused for a moment before it clicked. Ignoring the radio, he sprinted back towards the other side of the building, realizing he hadn't heard what Kersey had said next. The sniper looked down towards the street, expecting to see the zombies congregating around the warehouse, but didn't. Half of the creatures were focused intently on the partially open bay door, while another group of 20 or so had shambled back towards the ramped bay door. I think we might have trouble, Cap. I need you to hang on, Kowalski said urgently, clicking on his local communicator while taking a knee on the rooftop to minimize his exposure. Sarge, I need to know exactly where you are, Kowalski asked, his voice stern. What are you talking about, Kowalski? Copeland replied. Just tell me, Kowalski insisted, the urgency in his voice catching Copeland off guard. We're on the far end of the building to your right. Now tell me what in the hell is going on, Copeland demanded. I think we have trouble, Kowalski began to explain, but his words were jumbled with static and distortion. Say again, Sarge. I didn't copy, Kowalski repeated, straining to hear through the interference. He listened again, but could only hear static. It took a moment for a horrible realization to dawn on him. Someone was jamming their signal. Damn it, Kowalski cursed under his breath. He quickly pulled out the larger walkie-talkie, hoping that the extra power it provided could override the jamming. He hit the button and began speaking rapidly. Cap, we're in trouble. Someone is jamming our signal. Kowalski stopped talking, hoping for a response. All he could hear, however, was Kersey's faint voice coming through the static, too low to understand. Son of a. Kowalski trailed off as he pocketed the walkie-talkie and swung his rifle around, ready for action. For safety, he stayed low as he moved up towards the small wall at the edge of the rooftop to get a view of the street below. He focused his attention on the ramped bay door on his left, watching as the mob around it grew to 50 creatures, with dozens more shambling down the street. Why are you guys there? There's nobody close to that door, Kowalski muttered to himself, puzzled. He listened intently while looking through his scope towards the door, hoping to get a clue as to what was holding them there. It took several moments before he heard the faint sounds of a song. What the hell? Kowalski whispered, straining to make sense of it. While he couldn't quite make out the artist, it sounded like a 1950s big band type song. At least they have some class, Kowalski remarked dryly. He adjusted his aim to the base of the bay door, hoping to spot something. The throng of creatures pressed up against the door made it difficult to see clearly, but before too long, he spotted a small canvas bag sitting right in front of the door. How in the hell did they do that without me seeing it? Kowalski wondered aloud, his mind racing. As he processed the implications, a terrifying thought struck him. Someone had him in their sights. Rather than swing his head around quickly, which would alert his would-be watcher that he knew something was up, the sniper scanned the area in front of the warehouse while looking out of the corner of his eye. Kowalski couldn't see anything on the adjacent buildings to his left or right, which meant they were likely behind him. As he turned his head as far to the left as he felt comfortable doing, he spotted the roof hatch that was 5 yards away from him. Just do it, but don't half-ass it, Kowalski told himself, steeling his nerves. He took a deep breath before dropping straight to the rooftop, laying as flat as he could. A split second after he hit the roof, a gunshot from behind him echoed, and the whiz of a bullet buzzed overhead. Kowalski crawled as quickly as he could towards the open hatch as another shot rang out. The bullet hit just in front of him, mere inches away from his face. Holy shit, Kowalski exclaimed. He got within a few feet of the hatch, scrambling to his feet and diving forward, headfirst into the opening. As his head cleared the threshold, another bullet impacted the ground just off to the side of him, narrowly missing him. Kowalski grabbed onto the ladder rung as the rest of his body fell through the opening. Much to his surprise, he had enough strength to hold on. His legs flew past his head, slamming into the metal ladder as he steadied himself. Kowalski took a moment to get situated on the ladder, turning himself around and steadying himself before descending. He took a few steps before planting his boots on the outer portion of the rail and sliding down to the ground floor. As his boots met the concrete, he drew his handgun, sweeping the cavernous space for threats but not seeing anything. They've got to be coming this way. What the hell do I do? Kowalski muttered, weighing his options. After a brief moment of consideration, none of them particularly good, he let out a deep sigh, shaking his head as he ran to the other side of the warehouse. I got to get back up top to cover the others. And take out that son of a bitch who thought they could take a potshot at me when I wasn't looking, Kowalski muttered, pumping his legs hard, the thought of the rival sniper causing rage to build within him. Stopping just shy of the door, he approached it cautiously, not wanting to be spotted through the small window. Making sure he was out of a clear line of sight, Kowalski positioned himself just to the side of it, looking back towards the office section of the building. Jesus, Kowalski whispered in disbelief. He watched as a well-coordinated team of 6 men moved across the space between the buildings, approaching the office entrance they had gone through earlier. Looking down at his handgun, Kowalski knew that if he engaged them with no cover, he'd be cut down in seconds. Think, Kowalski, think, he urged himself, shaking his head in frustration. Rolling the dice, Kowalski looked fully out the window, relieved when he didn't end up with a hole in his head. Across the street, he saw several bay doors open and movement inside of them. "My God, they sent everybody after us," Kowalski murmured. He knew he couldn't go out that way either, leaving him with only one choice: the other side of the building and into the road where hundreds of zombies were congregating. Well, here goes nothing. Chapter 8. Kowalski darted across the vacant space inside the warehouse, getting halfway across before the door to the corner office area opened up. The door was thrown open with great force, slamming into the backstop as the lead militiaman stepped out. Kowalski heard him yelling something, but due to the distance between them, he couldn't understand it. The gunshots that soon followed led him to believe it was some variation of freeze. Kowalski could feel the bullets whizzing by his head as he continued to run. He adjusted his path, steering himself around some of the support beams in the middle of the floor, which provided him with a sliver of cover. Bullets pinged off the metal beams as the gunfire intensified behind him. However, he never looked back, instead focusing on the regular-sized fire door at the corner of the building. "Please be unlocked. Please be unlocked," Kowalski muttered under his breath as he put his head down and charged toward the door. He lowered his shoulder and plowed straight into the crossbar release. Much to his relief, the door flung open, his momentum carrying him into the road between the two warehouses. Waiting for him just outside the building was a throng of creatures, hundreds of them. Most of them were pressed up against the adjacent warehouse, desperate to get inside. However, several took notice of the sniper as he ran into the back of one of them. Kowalski shoved the creature forward into other nearby zombies, drawing all of their attention. Within seconds, a dozen ghouls were moaning and coming in his direction. Kowalski raised his handgun, firing one shot into the lead ghoul, dropping it and creating a tripping hazard for the others, buying him precious seconds. "Get running, man," Kowalski muttered to himself, motivating himself to move. He turned to his right and moved quickly up the street as the ghouls fell into line behind him. He managed to get 30 yards up before gunfire erupted behind him, bullets smacking into the pavement around him. Kowalski glanced over his shoulder, aiming his handgun in the general direction of the warehouse and firing. He was pretty sure he didn't hit anything, but the return gunfire was enough to make the militia take cover. Kowalski ran as hard as he could towards the next intersection between warehouses, continually glancing over his shoulder for the militia. He let out a sigh of relief as the zombies that had been interested in him were now attracted to the gunfire from the militia. While it was hard to tell exactly what was happening from a distance, it appeared as though the militia was having a difficult time getting the fire door shut. "That's what you get, assholes," Kowalski muttered under his breath, turning his attention back to the upcoming intersection as a dozen creatures began shambling out from around the corner. The sniper moved away from the building, putting a good 10 yards between himself and it. As he crossed over the intersection, he looked down the road and spotted dozens more ghouls shambling in his direction. "Well, that's not going to work," Kowalski murmured, shaking his head as he continued working his way up the road towards the next warehouse. His attention was grabbed by a shattered window on the next building. The floor-to-ceiling glass was in shambles, lying in pieces on the ground as if someone had shot it up in order to get inside. "I think that's as good as it's going to get," Kowalski said to himself. He ran towards the open window, spotting a couple of zombies shambling out from the interior of the building, drawn to the gunfire. Not wanting to give away his position, Kowalski drew his knife, readying it for battle as he approached. The first ghoul tripped over the debris on the ground, falling face first onto the pavement. Rather than take it out, Kowalski planted his foot on the ghoul's back and propelled himself forward, his blade leading the charge. The next zombie let out an excited moan that was silenced as the tip of the blade pierced through its eye. Kowalski didn't break his momentum, ripping his weapon free as he rushed by into the darkened office area. He managed to get a few steps inside the building when he heard movement and moaning, forcing him to take cover behind the front reception desk. Kowalski remained motionless for several moments, hoping that the noise of his entrance hadn't drawn too many ghouls in his direction. Despite his hoping, he heard several sets of footsteps shambling towards him. Kowalski ran through every curse word he had ever heard in his mind before poking his head over the edge of the desk, peering out into the darkness to see what he was up against. It was difficult to get a good read on things, but with the limited vision, he could still spot 6 distinct figures moving. Retreating back behind cover, Kowalski thought to himself, "Whatever you're going to do, Kowalski, you better think of it fast." He poked his head back over the edge, trying to find a way through the office. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he managed to spot a door that he hoped would take him out into the warehouse. "Okay, that's your play. You're going to run through this office, shove anything that's moving to the ground, and get out into that warehouse," he instructed himself. Kowalski paused for a moment, his thoughts still racing. "Then what, dumbass? What if there are more of those things out there?" "Well, you're going to keep running. That's what you're going to do. And you're going to find a way up to the roof so you can put a round in the ass of that dipshit that was taking pot shots at you. That's what you're going to do." Despite his best efforts to psych himself up, Kowalski was still hesitant. While he wasn't able to get himself moving, the zombie coming around the corner of the entrance did the trick. "Jesus." Kowalski yelled out in surprise as the ghoul shambled in from the outside, immediately moaning when it laid eyes on him. Kowalski jumped up, lunging forward to deliver a forearm into the chest of the ghoul, sending it staggering back. The clatter it made as it collapsed to the ground was more than enough noise to draw the other zombies in his direction. Before Kowalski could emerge from behind the front desk, 2 ghouls closed the gap, blocking him from getting into the aisle. The sniper didn't panic, however. Instead, he stepped back a couple of steps while smacking his hand on the desk. "Yeah, that's right. Come on. Line up behind them," he muttered. Much to his surprise, the zombies did as instructed, lining up behind their friends who were coming around the corner of the desk. Before the leaders got within arm's reach, however, Kowalski leapt over the desk, landing in the aisle away from the creatures and quickly making his way down it. Only one creature stood between him and the door to the warehouse, and with one forceful shove, the rotting corpse found itself face down in a cubicle. Kowalski rushed to the door, not pausing before throwing it open and running into the warehouse, which was stacked floor to ceiling with boxes. While it was dark, enough light was pouring in through the skylights that the sniper was able to get a lay of the land pretty quickly. "Ladder, ladder. I need a ladder," Kowalski muttered as he let out a frustrated grunt. The goods on the racks prevented him from being able to see the walls. Despite the obstacles, he managed to spot a catwalk that ran along the center of the building. "Now we're cooking," he said to himself. Kowalski found his way to the outer wall, shining his flashlight down the aisle to make sure the coast was clear. With nothing standing in his way, he picked up the pace, rushing down it towards what he hoped would be a ladder. "Now we're talking," he muttered, nodding his head excitedly as he found a ladder against the wall that led all the way up to the catwalk. "Just have to hope that there's roof access," he said to himself. After a lengthy climb, Kowalski found himself on the catwalk, giving him a bird's eye view of the warehouse. As he walked along it towards another small ladder in the middle of it, he looked down at the goods that were stacked high. "That figures," Kowalski muttered, shaking his head as his flashlight illuminated the boxes on the nearby racks, revealing that they were filled with office equipment chairs, desks, filing cabinets, all things that would have been quite valuable before the apocalypse, but now were worthless. Kowalski stopped at the base of the ladder, looking up towards the hatch leading to the roof. He swung his rifle around, loading it up so that it had a full magazine. The sniper focused on the task at hand, thinking intently about where he thought the other sniper was. "The shot came from behind you, not from the side. So he's at least 1 row back," he muttered, turning his body around, orienting himself before continuing. "You have to assume that their comms are working, which means this asshole is going to be looking for you," Kowalski said, taking a deep breath before beginning to climb the ladder. He paused briefly at the top before grasping the handle and twisting it unlocked. "Here goes nothing," he muttered as he opened the hatch as quietly as he could, managing to get it open without it slamming. He then climbed out onto the roof, staying on his stomach in the hopes that the edge of the rooftop would shield him from view. Once on top, he brought his rifle around, giving it one last check before nodding to himself. "Pop up, aim and shoot." "You got this," Kowalski muttered, steadying himself for a moment before quickly popping up to one knee and aiming his rifle in the general direction of where he thought the sniper would be. With a quick scan of the rooftops, he spotted a lone figure a couple hundred yards away. It took him a couple of seconds to get him within his sights, lining up the shot. Kowalski paused for a moment, watching his rival talking on the radio, completely unaware that he was living his last moments. "Got you, asshole," he muttered as he squeezed the trigger, sending a round right into the man's chest, dropping him into a heap on the roof. At this close distance, with the caliber of weapon he was using, even if the sniper had a vest on, it wouldn't have done him any good. Kowalski stayed low, looking around to the other rooftops to make sure they were clear. Once he was sure he was the only one with the high ground, he collapsed onto the roof, lying on his back. Well, that's one problem down at least. He muttered to himself, clicking on his communicator, hoping that the jamming had stopped. "Sarge, do you copy?" Kowalski said, letting out a sigh when there was nothing but static coming back over the line. "Okay, run through it, man. You've got at least one militia strike team setting up shop across from the warehouse. There's thousands of those things coming our way. And a couple hundred of them knocking on the door to the warehouse. About the only thing that's working in your favor at the moment is that they can't get into the building," Kowalski muttered, trying to think through the issue. Before he could continue, a deafening explosion ripped through the air. The rooftop rumbled beneath his back, prompting him to get to his feet and rush towards the edge of the building. A giant black cloud of smoke rose from the warehouse, the bay door completely obliterated by the explosion. While the first few rows of zombies had been decimated by the blast, hundreds more were lined up and ready to take their place. Kowalski watched helplessly as they began filing into the building, walking right up the ramp. Now what? The end.